Scotland. Renowned for its castles, lochs, wildlife, and stunning scenery. It's also a country that boasts a rich and proud history, from Mary Queen of Scots to the Battle of Culloden.
But for me, as an ancient historian, what's even more fascinating is when you go further back in time, beyond Scotland's written history, when you delve into this land's prehistoric past and the many mysteries still surrounding it.
Over 3 episodes, I'm going on a journey across Scotland to explore its distant past. With the help of leading experts along the way, I'll investigate the evidence. Monumental architecture constructed thousands of years ago.
A level of building that would be challenging to any master builder today, that's for sure.
New archaeological excavations unearthing the huge influence of this land.
When you look at the map of Britain and see Orkney at that kind of pivotal position, it's almost like turning the map of Britain on its head.
And incredible discoveries that are revealing who these ancient people were, how they lived, and how they interacted with a much wider prehistoric world.
Join me as we explore the extraordinary, enigmatic world of prehistoric Scotland.
To start the series, I'm exploring the Stone Age. I'm heading for one of the richest areas of prehistoric archaeology anywhere in Scotland, Orkney, a group of islands that lie off Britain's north coast. Today, it's easy to see Orkney as a place very much on the periphery, on the northern edge of the British Isles, far away from bustling international centres such as Edinburgh and London. But 5,000 years ago, it was a completely different story. Back then, this group of islands was right at the heart of things, a key part of an interconnected, vibrant Stone Age world, rich in stunning art and architecture. Today, Orkney is famous for monumental prehistoric structures, from formidable standing stones to some of the most impressive late Stone Age or Neolithic tombs found anywhere in the world, built to last. Now, the Stone Age structures themselves are fascinating, and we'll get to them. But I'm also keen to discover what we can find out about the prehistoric men and women who lived here on these islands. What has the archaeology revealed about how they lived, about what they thought and believed in? The Neolithic period in Orkney stretched almost 2,000 years, roughly between 4,000 and 2,500 BC. It's a large period in prehistory and an incredibly significant one, a period which witnessed one of the most important transitions in human history, when the people living here put aside their preceding hunter-gatherer lifestyle and adopted a more sedentary one, centred on agriculture. The people here became farmers. An expert on the lives and beliefs of these early farmers is archaeologist Dr. Antonia Thomas. She's taking me to one of the oldest structures in Orkney.
Wow. Antonia, it's such an incredible, albeit slightly eerie space. What exactly is this structure?
Well, this is what we call a chambered cairn. This is a burial site, an early Neolithic burial site, where people would have been laid to rest and buried. Its architecture is kind of typical of what we call the early Neolithic in Orkney, so the mid-4th millennium BC, around 3,500 BC. What characterises it is these big upright slabs that sort of divide off the space all the way around it. And these are what we call stalls or orthostats, and this is what we call a stalled cairn. It's a particular type of building from this time.
When do we think the Neolithic arrives in Orkney?
Well, Orkney's Neolithic is obviously like world famous, and we really kind of characterise it by these huge stone buildings. But what happened before that is a little bit of a mystery, and how that Neolithic emerged and appeared is still slightly fuzzy. What we do know is that people were here in the Mesolithic, and the Mesolithic is the period immediately preceding the Neolithic. It's the time of hunter-gatherers, when people were mobile, they were moving around the landscape, they weren't building permanent homes. And we have very little evidence from that time, really. An analogy that's often used is the needle in a haystack, and you'll hear that again and again, but it's absolutely so true. And we actually don't really know what was happening until around 3600, 3500 BC, when we start to see things like this appear.
The creation of grand structures such as Unston Cairn epitomised this seismic shift in human behaviour, when the people living in Orkney abandoned hunter-gathering and embraced farming.
And it's a huge, huge shift. It's not just a shift in patterns of life, but a whole kind of the conceptual way of thinking about the world. If you think about that change between moving around the landscape, hunting and fishing, and then settling down, farming, domesticating cattle, domesticating crops, building permanent homes for yourself, for the living, but also for the dead.
Archaeological discoveries suggest that the houses of these first Neolithic farmers were made out of wood, but they created tombs like Unston out of stone. It required a huge amount of labour to build such permanent structures, which begs the all-important question, who would have been buried here? Were these tombs built for an elite part of society?
We only ever have a snapshot of a population or of a time in archaeology, so we don't really know if it represents the whole of the population. And a lot of these sites were excavated in the 19th century or before, and maybe the records kept weren't as methodical as they would be today, so we have lost a lot of evidence. We do know that the way people were buried in these Neolithic tombs, people were not all laid to rest as individuals in the way that they do in later periods, but they were actually their bones were disarticulated, they weren't joined together, and they were jumbled up. It kind of highlights perhaps how their society was structured. So there's a certain equality in death. So it does it is suggestive of a kind of communal society. Once people were laid to rest, that wasn't the final say, if you like. So what it does indicate is that these structures weren't just a final place of rest, a burial place in the way we might think about it, but were actually sites for all sorts of rituals and performances, gatherings and different activities that perhaps went on for several generations, perhaps even for another millennium or more. And this site is a good example of that, because we do have evidence for later activity here.
Tombs like Unston were the monumental buildings of Orkney's early Neolithic. They were places of burial and ritual, entered again and again by Stone Age people for centuries after their initial construction.
These stalled structures are some of the earliest buildings that survive from Neolithic Orkney. But there's more to the story than just the building itself, because it was from within cairns like this one at Unston that archaeologists discovered a certain artefact that has now become closely entwined with the early Neolithic in Orkney, with these first Orcadian farmers.
This object was a beautifully crafted type of pottery, found again and again in early Neolithic tombs all across Orkney. To learn more about it, I've come to the National Museum of Scotland's Collection Centre to meet curator Dr. Hugo Anderson Wymark.
Hugo, we've got this incredible array of artefacts right here, but what sort of artefacts were found in a cairn like Unston?
Well, Unston, it's these artefacts we have on the end here. And when it was excavated in 1885, they dug through this very rich black charcoal-rich layer, and amongst it were lots of sherds of pottery, all broken up, a few flint tools, some animal bones, and human remains as well. But the pottery was the thing that this tomb really came to be known for. You can see they're very big sherds. They've been put together here, but that's because there were whole vessels just crushed into this deposit, more than 20 vessels.
More than 20 just in that one cairn?
Yes, and a good number managed to go back together to relatively complete vessels. And this was the first time this ceramic style had really been found in this quantity, and they realised it was a form of vessel they hadn't found before. And so this style of pottery has become known as Unston Bowl, after the tomb.
It's when you look closer at these bowls that you recognise their high quality. I can see there's some decorations on the side of this pottery. I mean, talk me through some of the details of it.
This style of bowl is characterised by having this slightly concave neck here, a very pronounced shoulder, and then being quite a shallow, open bowl. And so this style of pottery developed through the Neolithic and ultimately ended up in this form in Orkney and the Outer Hebrides. So we tend to find it just around that very north and west part of Scotland. But it's wonderfully decorated. They often went for a triangular pattern around the rim, and can you see it's what we call a drag and stab technique. You take a sharp bone or wooden point and you drag it along and stab it back. And so you end up with this very distinctive pattern along the edge.
There's indented long diagonal lines, aren't there? Yes.
Yeah. It's really exquisite. They went for a whole variety. You see a slightly different decoration on that one, but, you know, a similar style. So incredibly finely worked, and they often burnished the surface as well. So they're very smooth, very good quality pots.
And what can these pots, what can they tell us about these early Neolithic people who would have been buried in a cairn like Unston?
They probably went in there with different foods in them as offerings for the people who died. They may well have been consumed to some degree by the people who were at the ceremonies as well. We don't quite know. Obviously very important to the communities who had them. They spent a great deal of care making them and a great deal of care in how they deposited them in that tomb.
The 4th millennium BC marked the start of the Neolithic period in Orkney, with the construction of timber houses and stone-stalled cairns like this one. But this was only the beginning. Much more was still to come.
As the 4th millennium reached its end and the 3rd millennium began, these Neolithic Orcadians started to build even grander new types of monuments on Orkney. Monuments that today stand among the most iconic from the Neolithic period. It was the dawn of the megaliths, the great stones. These are the stones of Stoness, one of the oldest stone circles we know of from Western Europe. Originally, this circle consisted of 12 separate huge stones. Only 4 remain upright today, but standing next to them on this exposed plain, you can still get a sense of their monumental scale. And not far away from these stones, you can see the remains of an equally astounding Neolithic monument.
I've come to one of the most impressive stone circles in the British Isles, the biggest in Scotland. This is the Ring of Brochs. The ring itself consists of a lot of large standing stones. Walking around it now, you start to get a sense of its size and its scale, but it's most impressive when you see it from the air.
It's an incredible structure. To learn more about it, I'm meeting Professor Jane Downs.
Jane, this seems to be almost the pinnacle of stone circles in Scotland. It's such a massive construction. And what have excavations here revealed about its date?
The date of the Ring of Brochs has always been a big problem as to what it is, because Colin Renfrew excavated here in the 70s and didn't get any datable material. So Colin Richards and myself excavated his trenches and we found no charcoal, but we used a different method of dating. So we think the ring was dug around 2500 or 2600 BC.
So this massive stone circle is quite late in the story of Neolithic Orkney.
Yes, it is. It's right at the end of the Stone Age, or what we call into the Chalcolithic, or beginning of the Bronze Age, really.
And so how many stones were there here in total?
There were originally thought to be 60 stones, of which some had been taken away, presumably for things like building a stone field wall, and they had all fallen over. So the ones that you see stood up now have been stood back in the original places to reform the monument again.
The ring didn't exist in isolation. Surrounding the stones was a massive ditch, separating the circle from the rest of the landscape.
The ditch is incredibly wide and incredibly deep, so we can see it's quite substantial, and then when we dug through all the deposits, it's rock cut, and it's another few metres deep on top of what we're seeing here. So it's a really substantial feature, and in its day, being rock cut, when we re-excavated, it just shines white silvery colour, so it must have looked really, really impressive. As much as the stones, it would have been the ditch that would have cut people off, you know, formed a really definite boundary to say that this was a more sacred area.
Each standing stone is called a monolith, and as you look closer, you notice a lot of variation between them in their shape, colour and texture. These prehistoric people didn't source all of these monoliths from the same quarry, but from several different ones, one of which I'm heading to now.
I'm currently on my way to a hill called Vestra Fjord. It's a site of one of these ancient quarries, a source for this island's iconic Neolithic standing stones.
As you make your way up the hillside, you start to notice horizontal outcrops of stone. It was here that Neolithic Orcadians ventured to source their great monoliths for the Ring of Brodgar.
Now you'll notice how these sandstone outcrops run diagonally up the hill, parallel with the bedding plain below. This, combined with several other factors, such as the distance between these sideways fault lines, made them an ideal place for Neolithic people looking to pry away large slabs of sandstone. A key tool that these people would have been using to extract these slabs were hammerstones, basically pieces of stone that could fit in the palm of your hand that they would use again and again to bash the outcrop until they started to make their mark. Using tools like this, it's hard to fathom just how much time and effort it would have taken just to extract one of these great slabs. And this was simply to start the whole process. To extract a megalith, well, it would have taken a lot of people with a lot of dedication.
Today, you can still see the remains of some Neolithic monoliths that never left the quarry on the surface. And a recent excavation here, conducted in the early 2000s, revealed so much more about them.
This is what the archaeologists called Monolith 1. They excavated around it and made some exciting discoveries. They didn't find many hammerstones, which suggests that this monolith had originally been quarried further up the slope at a different outcrop. But the really exciting part was what they discovered directly underneath it. They found the remains of stone supports of an ancient trestle, upon which these Neolithic people had planned to place this monolith before exporting it out of the quarry. But disaster had struck. These stone supports had collapsed, the monolith had slipped backwards, and the whole process seems to have been abandoned, with this monolith remaining here ever since.
It's fascinating to think that some 5,000 years ago, this was an ancient quarry, where people were detaching sandstone monoliths like this one from the parent rock to be used in building monumental stone structures like the Ring of Brodgar.
But the Ring of Brodgar is situated several kilometres away from here, roughly over in that direction. These Neolithic Orcadians would have had to transport these massive monoliths, sometimes weighing as much as 10 tons, over a significant distance. So how did these people go about getting monoliths from a place like Vestra Fjord all the way over here to the Ring of Brodgar?
There have been a number of theories as to how people move stones in the past. I mean, sometimes people have thought that they might be floating them, but actually this loch was probably not such an open stretch of water, and it's more difficult perhaps to float a stone rather than to roll it. Recent experiments also tried sliding it on seaweed to use as a slippery surface, which worked to some extent. So I think it was just surely the fact that they could mobilise so much labour. These projects involve a lot of planning and a lot of getting together the resources.
So does it seem that the whole process of making this ring, of getting the stones here, was more important than the actual finished purpose of the stone circle itself?
In some senses, it could be felt that the process of creating this was as unifying as the ceremonies that might have taken place after it was built.
We don't know why these Stone Age Orcadians decided to build the Ring of Brodgar here, of all places. But almost certainly it served a communal purpose.
The finished monument would have almost undoubtedly be used for ceremonies, bringing people together. The scale of the ditch and the small size of the causeways that give access in and out is a profound sense of exclusion. So although it's not built walls as in the tombs, there is a sense that maybe the internal space, the interior of the monument, was restricted to certain people at certain times, and maybe other people were watching from the outside. Even now, if you stand in the centre, which of course you can't do now and you wouldn't do, and you make a loud sound, it bounces back to you, and that's even with the partial circle. So you can imagine that kind of acoustic effect when all the stones were there. You'd be chanting maybe or singing, and that sound would be resonating back to you. So yeah, the position is very particular.
The Ring of Brodgar is one of the great archaeological jewels in Neolithic Orkney's crown. But that stone circle over there, well, it didn't exist in isolation. It was part of a much larger landscape bustling with human activity. And here, on the nearby headland, an ongoing excavation has revealed so much more about this.
This is the Ness of Brodgar, home to one of the most significant and incredible archaeological excavations currently underway on the British Isles. The discoveries here have shed so much extraordinary light about the people of Neolithic Orkney and how they lived. To find out more about the dig, I'm meeting Dr. Nick Card.
Nick, it's really exciting to finally be at the excavation. But what do we think the Ness of Brodgar was?
Well, the Ness was in use for well over 1,000 years, in fact over 1,200 years, so spanning the whole of the Neolithic period in Orkney. And through that 1,000 years, its meaning, its function would have changed. But if you wanted to try and encapsulate what it was in its kind of heyday, I think it was a place of gathering, a place where people came from right the way across Orkney, but also from much further afield. And what do people do when they gather? They eat. They feasted here in very grand scale.
And so what has the archaeology revealed about the layout of this site?
Sort of almost been planned. It's not like town planning, but a lot of the structures, particularly in the phase that we're investigating just now, where you have these very large piered structures, all arranged around this kind of central paved area, complete with the stump of a standing stone, that they were laid out to respect each other. But they were also contained within a major walled enclosure, which initially we thought enclosed the whole site, but we now know it just consists of a major wall at the north end facing the Ring of Brodgar, another wall at the south end, but the two bodies of water creating kind of natural boundaries for the other two sides of the site.
Nick and his team have been working at the Ness of Brodgar for some 20 years now. In total, they believe that there are probably more than 100 Neolithic structures on the site, less than half of which have been excavated. And as you walk around, you start to realise how varied these visible structures were in their size and their splendour. From monumental, immaculately looking buildings that would have rested amongst the most spectacular in northwest Europe, to more peculiar structures like this one, complete with unusual masonry features such as these prone orthostats lying on their edge. Rich in material, the Ness is a jewel in the crown of British archaeology. And so how important do we think the Nesebrodga was back in Neolithic times?
I think it was a site that was probably renowned throughout Britain. We find material culture here that came from, for instance, pitchstone, a type of volcanic glass, a bit like obsidian that's found only on the island of Arran off the southwest coast of Scotland. We find mace heads here from the Western Isles of Scotland. We find an axe blank from the great Neolithic axe factories in Langdale in the Lake District. Some of the pottery is most closely resembles some of the pottery from southern Britain. The art is paralleled by art from Ireland. So a whole range of different kind of influences coming in. So I think that this was a place, maybe a pilgrimage at one stage of its life. And I think we see people coming here from not just across Orkney, from much, much further afield. So it's when you look at the map of Britain and see Orkney at that kind of pivotal position right at the tip of Scotland with access to the east and west coasts, I think it was very important then. And it is almost like turning the map of Britain on its head.
In its heyday, you can imagine the Nesebrodga being a settlement designed to awe and accommodate people venturing here from all over Orkney, Britain, and possibly beyond. This was a great centre of the Neolithic world, and even the smallest artefacts unearthed here have provided invaluable insight into what life was like 5,000 years ago. So Roy, we've got some really interesting artefacts here. These all to do with pottery, is it?
This is all pottery. It's called grooved-ware pottery. It's very distinctive, and we have about 100,000 pieces of it, which is by far the biggest collection of grooved-ware pottery in the country. It has an interesting history. The shape of the pot is very similar. It's either straight-sided or a bit flower-potty. The oldest dates we have for grooved-ware, although you get it right down what's now England and in Ireland, but the oldest dates we have are here in Orkney. Now, I'm not saying this particular site because we can't pin it down like that, but the oldest dates seem to be here, and then we can trace it on other Neolithic sites as we go south into Scotland and down to England and over to Ireland. We're not saying that people tucked a big pot under their arm and got into a boat and rowed off to Clacton on Sea or anything like that. It's the idea of the decoration, which must have really seized people's imagination. The earliest stuff was decorated with incisions, and that is patterns cut into the exterior surface of the pot with a sharp point. That pot was really well made, it was well fired, and then they moved on to cordons, applied cordons. Now, cordon is a strip of clay which they stuck onto the exterior of the pot in patterns, and then they could take little decorative slits and cuts into it as well.
As the Neolithic progressed, this cordoned grooved-ware pottery became the new fashion, gradually overtaking the incised Unston-ware pottery we saw earlier. But one of the most striking things you notice from some of these small shards of pot is the colour.
When you think about it, there's absolutely no reason why there shouldn't be colour in the Neolithic. But you look at the site, you've seen the site, it's quite grey. So it's too easy to assume, oh well, the Neolithic must have been a bit grey as well, a bit boring. No, they had colour. This is a cordon, one of these, but it's come off. It's detached from the pot. You see, it's got a flat back.
Yes, yes.
They're very easy to recognise when we're digging because it's got a flat back. But it's been decorated with hematite, which is an iron ore you get in Orkney. So they've applied the hematite, and that would have been a rich red 5,000 years ago, but it's not bad now. It's pretty old and it's still got a bit of colour to its face.
And it's also really interesting, isn't it, that you said that's hematite, that's an iron ore, but they're using it for decoration hundreds and hundreds of years before the Iron Age is even a thing.
Oh, well, many years, yes, many, many.
It's fascinating how small shards of seemingly insignificant pottery can give us such a valuable insight into the vibrant, colourful nature of a place like the Nesebrodga some 5,000 years ago. But pottery also gives us an extraordinary insight into their diet.
Yeah, we can analyse the pots to find out what they were using to hold them for, the storage, etc., but also cooking. If you find a bit of burnt blacky stuff inside a pot, you can analyse it and you can find out what it was. Actually, we don't even have to go as far as that now because the pot is porous, it's low fired. So if you had some meat inside it and you were cooking it, or anything indeed, it releases lipids, fats, and they soak into the wall of the pot. So all we have to do, even if we don't have any black gungy stuff, is take out a little piece of the pot wall and analyse it. And the studies we've done so far they're about 50-50 milk and meat. So that was their diet, though there is a problem. They were lactose intolerant, which means they couldn't take milk. People still are in some places. It bloats you up and makes you feel really rotten. So if you process it into a yogurt or a cottage cheese type of thing, you can eat it perfectly well. So we think they were processing milk as well.
And so what can this pottery tell us about the economics of this place?
Well, they can tell us that they were very largely cattle-based, although they were growing barley as well, because you can find traces of that. A lot of the methods of analysis, the scientific methods of analysis, have really improved recently. So we're hoping in the next 2 to 3 years to have some really detailed analysis of the contents of the pot. And that might bring up some surprises. There might be something else in there that we don't know about yet.
The Kneser excavations have already revealed so much about Neolithic Orkney, and no doubt the work of the archaeologists and volunteers here will continue to unearth extraordinary artefacts in the years ahead. 5,000 years ago, this was an incredibly important meeting place, but it doesn't seem to have been a residential settlement. And that's what I want to learn more about next.
Fortunately, I've come to the right place.
In the winter of 1850, a vicious storm ravaged Orkney's coastlines. Here at Scale Bay, the tempest was so ferocious that the power of the wind and the waves ripped up the grassy earth from the top of a large group of sand dunes called Skara Brae. But this was a blessing in disguise, because what this act of nature accidentally unveiled was absolutely astonishing. The remains of prehistoric stone buildings.
The man who investigated the remains following the storm was William Graham Watt, the local Orcadian laird living at nearby Scale House. It was Watt who instigated the first excavations here, enlisting the help of local antiquarian George Petrie.
Thankfully, we still have Petrie's report of this initial excavation. It was published some 20 years after Watt made this discovery. And I've got excerpts from the report here, and in it, Petrie mentions how the ruins of Skara Brae are altogether so different in type from any hitherto discovered. The buildings may be generally described as a group of chambers and cells arranged on both sides of and opening into a long zigzag or winding passage, which runs nearly parallel with the line of beach.
Petrie refrained from proposing a date for Skara Brae in his report, but he did make an interesting assumption. Given the evident constructive skill of those who built Skara Brae, Petrie assumed that such a settlement could not have been built by people who primarily used flint and stone tools, what he called rude implements. Skara was certainly an ancient site, but Petrie assumed that it must have dated to an age of metal, to the Bronze or Iron Age.
In short, Petrie didn't believe that this settlement could date to the Stone Age. He didn't think it could be that old. He followed the common view of the time that Stone Age people weren't sophisticated enough to make something like Skara. It was a bold assumption. Whether it would stand the test of time, however, was another matter.
More and more work at the site occurred throughout the following century by famous archaeologists such as Professor Gordon Vere Child. As the digs progressed, more and more buildings were unearthed, more artefacts were dated, conclusions started to be reached.
Petrie's initial assumption was proved wrong. This settlement did date to the Stone Age. What these archaeologists and antiquarians had uncovered in the wake of that vicious storm was the best preserved Neolithic settlement in Western Europe.
The small collection of closely connected houses you can see at Skara Brae today is just a snapshot of the Neolithic village itself. Surveys of surrounding fields have revealed that the village was much bigger in its day, with the settlement seemingly growing in size as the Neolithic progressed. Thanks to the remarkable level of preservation at Skara, here you can get a real insight into what homely life was like for those Neolithic Orcadians living on this western coastal edge of Orkney. And Jane has kindly agreed to show me around one of these houses.
So these are the passageways, which are quite narrow, and of course would have had a need to crouch to come into the building, but of course that bit's gone now, but we could do an imaginary crouch. And coming into this building, you can see these fantastic remains of the beds and the hearth.
Jane, it's incredible.
Isn't it special?
So this is the interior of a 5,000-year-old residential home. This is how it was laid out.
Yes, and actually you're steered in a certain direction to walk around the hearth in the part that's slightly wider, and then you have a narrower way around there. So this is all part of the sort of way that you're made to walk around these houses, which are quite formulaic in the way they're laid out.
Well, it's incredible to actually be here and to be standing here. I mean, but first of all, what is this key feature that we've got in front of us here?
So Tristan, in front of us we have the hearth, which is always stone built, a very substantial piece of architecture and quite large in relation to the size of the floor area. Then either side you see these boxes, these stone boxes are actually beds. They're called beds and they probably were beds. And then in front of us we see the most special part of the house, the innermost rear part where the dresser is.
Oh, so would that have been one, would it then?
Yes, you can see the uprights of the dresser. The pillars that then held the shelves, and quite often they're a two-storey arrangement. So these are called dressers, but actually to me these are more like house altars. Sometimes there are optional extra beds, so here we have an additional one. And the other thing that you see as well are these tanks. So these are tanks or boxes.
Oh yes.
These could have held multiple types of things. So some people have said they were used to hold bait, because some of them are sealed so that you could contain water within them. And then others, Gordon Child found things like the bone beads, necklaces within them. So some of them were maybe for holding or containing precious items.
But arguably, Skara Bray's most striking feature isn't in any of the houses, it's beneath them.
So the sophistication of this architecture that we can see visibly is nothing to the sophistication of the drainage systems which underlie these villages, and this is something that you find in early Neolithic and later Neolithic villages. They have very complex drainage systems. So every part of the house is drained. There's drains for these little recesses, which is why some people have interpreted them as lavatories, perhaps they were. Drains for the hearth and the bed, little drains that then all feed into larger drains which underlie the passageways, and then they all feed into much bigger drains that then take all the effluent out to the body of water, the loch, probably in the past. So in this hatch, if we open it up.
Oh wow, look at that. Drains like this are underneath the whole of the Skara Bray village.
That's right, yes. This is one of the main drains, one of the big ones that all the others would come into.
It's incredible to get this small glimpse into the secret underworld of Skara Bray, epitomising the architectural prowess of these Neolithic farmers. And the archaeology unearthed here was equally astonishing. Finely carved jewellery made out of bone, such as bead necklaces and dress pins, polished stone axe heads, and also ochre pots, still with the colour visible within. But not all objects uncovered at Skara Bray have a clear function. The purpose of some are much more mysterious. And this is especially true of one particular set of enigmatic objects, several of which are today in the National Museum of Scotland's collections.
Hugo, these have really caught my eye, these 5 objects here. They look absolutely extraordinary, but what exactly are they?
Well, your guess is probably as good as mine, but they are some really fine examples of sort of ground sculpted stone objects, which really don't defy often a functional interpretation. And so we have both plain balls here, we have balls here which are very sort of finely polished and
With
decorated.
decoration on as well, can't you? Yeah,
and we know this was made probably at Skara Brae because the rock it's made from is found on the beach outside the settlement.
Right. Okay, so locally made, locally
Yes.
produced.
Yes, but you can see, the more you catch the light on it, the more you can see these fine patterns, grid-like patterns, characteristic of sort of grooved ware style designs. It's a very nice sort of diamond lattice there.
Yes, I see this decoration. So they put some time and effort into these. But it's so interesting as well. You get these rounder, smoother examples, but looking there, you get some much rougher ones too.
Yeah, and we also get very finely decorated forms. That's perhaps most distinctive.
Yes.
In that you can see it's got 6 knobs on the surface. So this is a classic sort of carved stone ball that we find in the late Neolithic. Mostly in Aberdeenshire we find that style of carved stone ball, but there are around 20 odd examples from Orkney, and again this one made locally of camptonite from the local beach. You can see the way it's got little incised grooves on the surface there. But Orkney also developed its sort of own style of carved stone ball.
This one looks incredibly interesting, just because it looks so, I guess, symmetrical in a way too.
Yeah, covered in these tiny little pyramidal knobs. Very distinctive Orcadian style, but yes, exceptionally finely worked. You'll see that only 1 or 2 of the knobs have any form of damage on them at all.
What these distinctive balls were used for continues to be hotly debated.
There are dozens of theories, but we often see them interpreted as potentially being hafted as mace heads, and you find a lot of mace heads in the late Neolithic. They could deliver quite
That would do a
blow.
lot of damage, yeah.
But again, not many of these knobs have damage on them. They could also be a toy, a game. They could also be a symbolic object, something of very much importance, symbols of power within the community for the people that hold them. But we really don't know. There are so many different interpretations, but it does seem they could well be weapons or symbolic weapons.
Even though Neolithic Orkney was a place very much interconnected with a wider prehistoric world, artefacts like these mysterious balls showed how these people also retained their own traditions, visible within Orcadian communities like those living at Skara Brae.
5,000 years ago, Skara Brae was just one of many Neolithic communities in Orkney. It wasn't anything special. But fast forward to the present day, and this group of houses down there have become one of the most famous Neolithic sites in the entire world, thanks to its astonishing preservation.
There aren't many places in Orkney that can rival the stunning preservation of Skara Brae. But there is one, a tomb renowned the world over.
During the early Neolithic in Orkney, tombs were defined by the so-called Orkney Cromarty cairns, stored cairns like the one we've seen at Unston. But as the Neolithic progressed, these tombs became more and more elaborate, ultimately resulting in some of the most immaculate pieces of stone architecture from anywhere in the Neolithic world. The most elaborate tomb of them all is right up ahead. This is Mace Howe, a massive chambered cairn dating to around 3000 BC. As you approach it, you already start to get a sense of its scale. The mound today is some 10 meters in height with a diameter of some 25 meters. And originally surrounding this cairn, there would have been a stone wall and a ditch. The remains of the latter, the ditch, you can still see the outline of today.
Already, you start to get a sense that this tomb was designed to mesmerise any who laid eyes upon it. But the best is still to come.
Once you've gone through the entrance, you find yourself in this small passageway, roughly a metre in width, with these giant slabs of stone on either side. The passageway itself goes on for some 10 metres, just over 10 metres, until you emerge into this great central stone chamber.
Chambered cairns can be found all across Orkney. But what makes Maes Howe so special is its exquisite craftsmanship.
The stonework here is absolutely incredible. It makes something like Unston Cairn pale in comparison. This central stone chamber is larger than any of Maes Howe's Orcadian counterparts, but it's in the walls where you start to really see the quality of this tomb. These walls are dry stone, so they were made without mortar. And you'll notice how they start lower down vertical. But as the wall gets further up, you'll notice how they start to curve inwards until they would ultimately have joined with the other side to form a roof. It's a construction technique called corbelling. It's an impressive feat of engineering. These Neolithic Orcadians, well, they were farmers, but they were also builders too. And it's only in a place like here that you really get a real sense of that. In the walls, you notice these squares leading off to smaller chambers called cells. There are 3 of them in total here at Maes Howe. And in each of the corners, you'll notice these stones protruding from the wall, each with their own monolith. Now, originally, it was thought that these stones were to serve as buttresses to support the whole stone structure, but no longer. It's now believed that these served no structural purpose whatsoever. They were just for show. It's hard to fathom how much time and effort, how many people, how much monumental stone material it would have taken to build a cairn like Maes Howe. This was a tomb designed to impress, to awe, to amaze.
Who Maes Howe was meant to amaze is a difficult question to answer.
Almost certainly, Maes Howe was designed to be a tomb, to house a prominent figure or family in later Neolithic Orkney. But as you make your way out of the cairn, you start to realise how this structure would have been very closed off. For instance, this large triangular slab of stone here would have been used to seal the passageway to bar entry.
And further out too, you had a deep surrounding ditch as well as a stone wall. Unlike at the Ring of Brodgar, there were no causeways across this massive ditch. If these outer constructions were made at the same time as Maes Howe, then those building this tomb were determined to seal it off from the rest of the Orcadian world as soon as the building was complete.
If this was the case, could it be that the people who this tomb was meant to amaze were the builders themselves? That the communal process of constructing this monumental tomb and the authority such a process provided for those overseeing its construction was just as, if not more important, than the tomb's final purpose. It's possible, although we'll never know for sure. But one thing is for certain, with contemporary Neolithic settlements all around, chambered tombs like Maes Howe would have remained incredibly noticeable in the landscape for centuries following their initial construction. Visible houses of the dead, spirits of the ancestors.
Chambered tombs like Maes Howe are some of the finest monumental structures that survive from the Stone Age. Stunning examples that evoke the stone-working prowess of these prehistoric people by the early 3rd millennium BC. But stone would not remain the prime material of choice for much longer. By roughly 2500 BC, great change was on the horizon in Orkney. It was the dawn of the Bronze Age. For a long time, the end of the Neolithic was seen as a period when Orkney's prominence decreased due to the noticeable lack of monumental Bronze Age architecture that survives here compared with the preceding Stone Age. But now, that view is changing.
Well, I think all too often that the Bronze Age in Orkney is seen as this kind of retro step happening, that suddenly the grandeur of the Neolithic is replaced by this almost kind of ephemeral Bronze Age presence, but it's not. We still find fantastic burial monuments across the islands, like the Nauza Trotty, just across the Loch of Harry, where there was gold discs and amber beads discovered in a massive Bronze Age burial tomb. I think it was just a different emphasis happening in society in the Bronze Age, where it was much more to do with the individual rather than the larger community.
The Stone Age in Orkney had reached its end, but the importance of its great structures endured.
All these monuments continue to be very much parts of the landscape. It wasn't suddenly at the end of the Neolithic that they were ceased to be recognised. And for instance, the stones of Stoness, we find much later Iron Age activity at the stones. So they're still parts of the local lifestyle, mythology almost.
So these stone structures constructed in the Neolithic, their legacy lives on even down into the Bronze Age and further on from then?
I think like all the monuments here, their legacy lives on right to the present day. And even when you look at kind of the myths and legends of Orkney within the historic period, a lot of them relate to these monuments. And everybody puts their own interpretation on them.
We might think of Orkney as a place on the periphery, but some 5,000 years ago, this was a great centre. An important hub with connections that stretched across Britain, Ireland and beyond. A place where beliefs, ideas and practices originated and spread across the known world. Home to some of the most iconic and immaculate Stone Age structures from anywhere in the world.
But for me, what's been most interesting of all has been learning more about the people who made these monumental structures. Looking at artefacts that have revealed more about how they lived, objects that are adding more colour to the lives of these ancient people who lived here some 5,000 years ago, all at the heart of a golden age in the story of prehistoric Scotland.
Orkney's extraordinary Neolithic is a fascinating tale in the story of Scotland's prehistoric past. But this is only the beginning. As the years went on and the trade of metals increased, great change would start to occur all across northern Britain.
New people would arrive on Scotland's shores, bringing their own objects, beliefs and practices with them. New centres of trade and connectivity would rise, and it's to one of the most extraordinary of these emerging centres, some 200 miles south of here, that we'll be heading to next.
Join me in episode 2 as we head to Kilmartin Glen to uncover the mysteries surrounding some of Scotland's oldest rock art. I'm leaving Stone Age Orkney behind me, and I'm heading south to the beautiful region of Argyll in western Scotland, and to one of the best preserved prehistoric landscapes in the whole of Britain, Kilmartin Glen. Surrounded by hills on two sides and running parallel with Scotland's west coast, this valley is home to a rich array of stunning stone and Bronze Age remains, including more of this land's iconic monoliths.
These are fascinating legacies of Scotland's prehistoric past. But for me, what's just as interesting, if not more interesting, are the smaller, more minuscule details. Details such as these. You'll notice these indents on this particular rock. Now, they're not natural. These are man-made, and you'll also notice if you look closely enough that surrounding a couple of these, you'll notice a circle, a ring. So what exactly are they? What are they doing on exposed pieces of rock like this? And how do they fit into the story of this extraordinary area?
I've come to Kilmartin Glen to learn more about the mysterious rock art that this valley is famous for, and to see how prehistoric communities based around here used and reused it for more than 1,000 years.
Evidence for human activity at Kilmartin Glen possibly dates as far back as the 6th millennium BC and the Mesolithic period. But it's at the end of the subsequent Neolithic period, the beginning of the 3rd millennium BC, that we really start seeing significant human activity in this area, with the construction of some striking and familiar structures.
At the heart of Kilmartin Glen today is a multitude of prehistoric monuments. And near the centre is Temple Wood Stone Circle, one of the most ancient sites still visible in the Glen. Hiding in plain sight here are some astonishing relics from our ancient ancestors. To help me find them, I'm teaming up again with Dr. Hugo Anderson Weimark.
So Hugo, first off, this stone circle looks very impressive, but it wouldn't have originally looked like this when it was first constructed.
No. To understand this, you have to take away a lot of this stonework. In fact, you have to take away all of this cairn material, all of the kists in the middle, until you just have the upright stones left. And that would have been the original Neolithic monument at this location here.
Dated to roughly 3000 BC, Temple Wood has similarities with the stone circles we've already seen in Orkney in its structure and its purpose. This was probably a place for communal activities, for performances and celebrations. But Temple Wood also has a remarkable hidden feature.
So Hugo, you've taken me over here, but what's so special about this particular stone?
Well, if you shine your light down this face here, you'll see what's special about this rock.
Oh yes, I can see some lines here. What is this?
And if you look very carefully, it's a spiral, and there's 3 lines that spiral out here all the way around this rock.
Oh, okay.
And then they go round the corner.
This rock art isn't just interesting because of its age, but because of what it tells us about Kilmartin Glen and its connection to the wider Stone Age world.
This spiral is a very distinctive spiral because it has these 3 grooves that go all the way around it. It looks very reminiscent of a spiral that is seen in Ireland. The spiral is something we also see up in Orkney, in passage graves in Orkney. So here we are, sort of midway between the two.
What does this therefore tell us about the connections of the people who were living here at this time?
Well, it tells us a lot about people moving through the landscape. We're talking about people connecting across these very long distances in the Neolithic, bringing ideas backwards and forwards, and ideas and beliefs.
But this faint bit of rock art at Temple Wood is a mere taste of what Kilmartin Glen has to offer. Because this area of Scotland boasts the richest concentration of rock art in the whole country. And it can be found in some truly spectacular places. I've come to Achnabrec, just south of the Glen, to get a better look at this art. Here, on these huge slabs of exposed rock, are not just a couple of these ancient carvings, but dozens.
These interesting circular designs can be found at various places all across Kilmartin Glen, on exposed rocks such as this one here at Achnabrec. But it does beg the question, what exactly are they? And what are they doing here?
To find out more, I'm meeting archaeologist Dr. Joanna Valdez-Tullett, an expert on these mysterious motifs.
So these are cup and ring motifs. They are part of a prehistoric carving tradition that we call Atlantic rock art. And essentially they are little hollows and they are surrounded by rings.
As well as the circular designs, this great rock is also marked with straight lines that join some of the circles.
The rock surface would be really important when it came to create the rock art. And what we see here is an example of the use of the natural features of the rock that are incorporated into the composition of the rock art. So what they're doing here, they're using this natural fissure that you can see comes from that end of the panel and it goes straight onto that side, and they are using it to recreate a radial. So radials are lines that are often created or carved with the cup and ring motifs, but they are just lines that come from these features. And usually they are carved, but in this instance what they're doing is they're just using the natural fissure to recreate that linear line, that radial.
And it says it's carved and then almost connecting to the natural fissure in how it's been designed.
Exactly. We will see in this panel specifically, we will see some examples of that. But exactly as you're saying, this line is coming from the central cup mark and it's joining to the natural fissure here.
This interplay of the motifs with natural features is a common characteristic of Atlantic rock art. And as the name suggests, it's not just in Scotland that we find examples of it.
We do have this type of rock art with connections to what we have here in Scotland elsewhere. So we find Atlantic rock art also in England, but also in Ireland and also in Iberia. So we have them in Galicia, in the Spanish province of Galicia, and also in northern Portugal. Atlantic rock art is very much an idea that was grasped between all of these communities because we see it recreated. It's not just about the similarity of the shapes, but it's in the way that it was created. So this interplay with the motifs and the natural features is something that we see in all of these regions that I mentioned across the Atlantic seaboard. The way that they are placed in the landscape is very similar as well. So there is this ideology that they are all sharing, and that was very much transmitted throughout these exchanges. They had their own cultures, their own beliefs, but there was something very special about this type of rock art. They were recreating it across their own landscapes.
The discovery of similar rock art in places as far away as Portugal is further proof of how Stone Age people and their ideas travelled along Europe's Atlantic seaboard some 5,000 years ago.
Joanna, it begs the all-important question, what does all of this mean? Why do we think they made this rock art?
So that's a really, really big question, and the straight answer is we don't know.
Oh, okay.
But we have a few theories around. So Ronald Morris was an archaeologist who worked here in Scotland for several decades, and in one of his books he suggests 104 theories, ranging from a function related to predicting solar events, lunar events. There was also the idea that these could have been ancient writings, and so these were the first theories that emerged about rock art. Later on, we see another perspective which moves the focus of rock art research from the motifs to the wider landscape. There's a reason why they chose this place to carve and not that one over there. There is this idea that the rock art could be marking routeways or pathways, could be related to areas of the landscape that were really important for people. There is also suggestions that this could be a mean of communication between groups of people who lived in the same area but didn't really come across each other very often.
It's astonishing to think that even 5,000 years ago, people, goods, and crucially ideas were being transported all across the British Isles and beyond. And this area seems to have been an important place along the route of this Stone Age motorway, evidenced by its enigmatic rock art. But how exactly did they make these motifs? Hugo is going to give me a hands-on demonstration.
It's a relatively simple process, and you make it by hammering it with stone and grinding it with stone to the sort of finish you want.
So what sorts of tools do we think they would have used to make rock art like this?
Well, in this area, there's lots of glacial cobbles or cobbles in the glacial deposits, and so you can find all sorts of different sort of granites, metamorphic rocks. Quartz is quite useful as well. You want a really hard rock, something harder than the stone you're working. But a variety of shapes are good. For pounding out cut marks, a nice rounded surface is good. But for doing finer work, you want a sharp edge or a sharp point to work with.
To draw out the patterns on the rock, Hugo uses charcoal. He outlines two designs, a cup and ring mark and a spiral.
So Hugo, the lines have been drawn, the jackets are taken off, it's time to work. How do you suggest that I should begin?
Maybe pick this hammerstone. That's quite a nice edge to work with.
Yep, okay, yep.
And then what you want to do, grip your hammerstone, not too hard, take aim on the black line, and then just a nice peck. Doesn't have to come up too high.
And work from the centre out, do you think, from the main thing?
Yeah.
I just keep going and going and going.
Just keep going. If you're not seeing any stone coming off, you're going to have to hit it harder.
Okay. I'm seeing something there.
Yeah, I'm seeing, there, a bit of red.
See the chips starting as well? Yep.
Yeah.
You're starting to see the indent much quicker than you would on let's say, a harder stone that is more common in this part of Scotland.
Yeah, so I'll just start moving over the rest of that black surface.
Okay.
Now.
Something you really notice as you start making the rock art is the sound.
That repetitive pounding we're hearing, it drums in your ears, doesn't it? It's a real part of the performance of making rock art. And certainly in the Neolithic, there would have been a lot of people watching you make rock art. They'd have been hearing that sound. They'd have been seeing all this dust blowing around. So it would have been a real event.
You can imagine those sounds, those repetitive beating sounds echoing across a landscape like this, can't you? Thousands of years ago.
Yeah, for hours on end, people in the glen below you would be knowing that you were making rock art up here.
Oh, fascinating.
As we continue bashing away at the rock with the hammerstones, soon enough, the faint outline of the motifs start becoming visible.
That is looking fantastic.
Look at that.
Yeah.
You can really feel the grooves now, can't you?
Yeah, you can feel them, and you can feel the individual pits on the surface.
Oh yes, so from the individual hit marks.
Yeah, each one of them a little bit of your hard effort.
How interesting.
So what we need to do now is make that just a little bit smoother. So we'll grind it with the edge of a stone.
Yep.
Nice rounded stone. We'll just grind it down a bit, and that will finish it off.
After grinding our designs down for a little while, a quick brushing of the dust off the rock and a sprinkling of water reveals our final products.
Oh, there we go. Look at that. The colours come out that stone. That's fantastic.
You can really see the patterns there, can't you? The indent of the stone. It really shows how it might have taken quite a bit of time on that harder rock, but the rewards were very much worth it.
It's incredibly close to the designs you can see on Achnabrec.
It's absolutely remarkable.
By the end of the Neolithic period, Kilmartin Glen was interconnected with a much wider Neolithic world that stretched all across Britain and Ireland, evidenced by the stone circles and rock art motifs like this, which you can still see today. But this was only the beginning of Kilmartin Glen's prehistoric activity. Great change was just around the corner. In the mid-3rd millennium BC, a new age dawned in Britain. The Neolithic reached its end, and the Chalcolithic, or Copper Age, began, a time of great significance for Kilmartin Glen and its prehistoric landscape, with the arrival of new people, originally from distant shores.
It was a seismic moment in the story of Kilmartin Glen, and indeed for all of Britain. These new people, known as the Beaker people because of the elaborate pottery they were buried with, would transform not just the landscape, but the population too. To find out more, I'm meeting Dr. Matthew Knight at the National Museum of Scotland's Collection Centre.
This is the skeletal remains of a young adult female buried 4,500 years ago. We've been able to radiocarbon date her to around 2450 BC to around 2150 BC. And this places her right at that transitional period from the late Neolithic into the Chalcolithic, when the Beaker people were first starting to arrive in Britain. We can go a step further. Analysis of her teeth in the form of isotopic analysis indicated that she probably wasn't born in Scotland. She was probably non-local. The isotopes that were analysed for this individual suggested that she perhaps grew up in Eastern Britain, maybe Eastern Ireland, or perhaps even on the continent in Northern Europe. And genetic analysis of this person has indicated that her ancestry derives from the continental steppe around Central Europe, perhaps around the region of the Netherlands. So, putting all of this together, what we can say about this person is that although they were buried on an island off the west coast of Scotland, she didn't grow up there. And we can say that she might have been one of the first of the so-called Beaker people to travel from Northern Europe across Scotland to where she was eventually buried.
And it's so significant, isn't it, in the story of Kilmartin Glen and this area of Scotland. It really emphasises that how, at this period, there's this great almost step change, this new population coming in.
Yeah, we know that lots of people were moving around at this time. What's happening is small groups of people are coming in and they're integrating with society through localised marriages and communal connections that over time transforms the genetic data that we see in people in the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age.
The Chalcolithic is seen very much as this transitional period between the Stone and Bronze Ages, roughly lasting between 2500 and 2200 BC. Why these new people decided to come to Kilmartin Glen at this time is unclear, but it may be to do with their quest for copper. We know that copper deposits existed around the glen, and we know that the Beaker people were searching for sources of this revolutionary metal. Their arrival at Kilmartin Glen and the surrounding area, with their own ideas, beliefs and practices, would greatly affect what happened next.
The latter half of the 3rd millennium BC is seen as something of a golden age in the story of Kilmartin Glen. Within a few centuries of these first Beaker graves, you see the people here, well, significantly changing the whole landscape. Rock art outcrops were prized up, standing stones were moved. But the most striking example of this great landscape change at that time is where I'm standing right now. Here, and stretching all the way beyond the trees over there, up there, you have the creation of this great linear cemetery, initially composed of 6 monumental cairns, the oldest of which is right here.
This tomb is called Netherlargy South Cairn. Originally, this was a Neolithic tomb constructed roughly 5,000 years ago. But it wasn't long before these new people converted it for their own purposes, remodelling it into how it looks today. They enlarged the tomb and transformed its original Stone Age rectangular mound into a round one. Netherlargy South became a tomb for their own elites. All along the valley, these people created more of these vast mounds. The whole Neolithic landscape was radically changing.
Kilmartin Glen was transforming into this place for burials. And not just any burials, but elaborate, monumental ones for only the richest in these prehistoric societies. The big question, therefore, is why?
Well, it's all to do with one of the greatest technological revolutions in human history, when the age of copper came to an end and the Bronze Age began. Dr. Alison Sheridan is able to tell me more.
That is a period when people got very rich very quick in Kilmartin Glen, and they showed off their wealth. And we think that they got rich because they were able to control the flow of metal that was coming from Ireland and was then going up the Great Glen into northeast Scotland. We can't say for sure whether it was copper or bronze that was coming through, because essentially the copper will have come from southwest Ireland, the tin will have come from Cornwall or Devon, would you believe. We know that it was being made into bronze in Ireland, so either copper or bronze was coming up.
Kilmartin Glen became a Bronze Age staging post for the flow of valuable metals. And the people overseeing this metal trade through the valley were the tycoons of their day. High-status individuals who were intent on impressing the locals.
You know, to be allowed to have a high-status grave in a pre-existing important area means that they were treated with respect. They must have made an amazing impression on the local people.
I'm keen to have a look at one particular object that really epitomises the power and wealth of these Bronze Age elites. So I'm heading back to see Matthew at the Collection Centre. This is the Poltalloch necklace, a stunning piece of jewellery discovered in one of Kilmartin Glen's many Bronze Age burials. This extraordinary object is made from over 100 beautifully crafted beads of exquisite Whitby jet. It's more evidence of the movements of people and goods all across the British Isles, and yet more proof of the power and status of the people who chose to be buried in Kilmartin Glen.
These are referred to as spacer plates to space out the necklace, and they're decorated with small holes that would have been incised into them to create these really lovely geometric shapes. But the Bronze Age people went a step further, and in some of these incisions what you can see are small white inclusions, and analysis of those white inclusions has shown that this is a form of white paste made from calcined bone that was burnt and then ground up and then inserted to create this really strong contrast of white decoration and the black jet.
It is striking, really striking, but what also seems really striking is keeping on those details and those patterns. If we look at these ones here on either side, this almost looks like you see Neolithic designs, similar to the butterfly kind of stones. You see them in Yorkshire, you see them in Orkney, and now you see this depiction here too.
Yeah, I think there's a long-standing tradition in terms of geometric patterns showing up. And so you see geometric patterns showing up on some of the beaker pottery. You also see it on some metalwork at this time, particularly gold ornaments. So there's a whole variety of motifs that remain really important to the people of Kilmartin Glen and Britain more widely during the early Bronze Age.
But not everything is quite as it seems.
The majority of the necklace is produced from Whitby jet, but this bracelet of a series of beads was produced from a jet-like material called cannel coal or perhaps shale, and that suggests that someone is trying to imitate the beads you see in the necklace and kind of complete the set, as it were. It's incredibly hard to the naked eye to distinguish between the two materials, and this is where the scientific analysis shows us some of these kind of personal decisions that were made, where someone is making a like-for-like object.
And so what does the burial of an object such as this, such as the bracelet, such as this pottery, what does it tell us about the importance of Kilmartin Glen, of this area of Scotland in the early Bronze Age?
The whole culmination of elaborately decorated pottery, finely made ornaments, as well as the aggrandised burial cairns, all really speaks to something quite significant happening in Kilmartin Glen during the Chalcolithic and into the early Bronze Age.
This seems like this is this key centre of connectivity, but also the people buried here, well, the objects like this, it's a statement of power and of wealth.
Yeah, absolutely.
This necklace is an extraordinary insight into Kilmartin Glen's newfound prominence in the early Bronze Age. The people who decided to be buried here were the billionaires of their day, and some would even reuse the valley's more ancient rock art in their burials. Hugo is going to take me to see a striking example at one of these cairns.
So here we are inside another one of these netherlagi cairns. There's the kist, the burial itself. What exactly is this?
Well, this slab originally went on the top of this kist. It was the very large capstone covering this kist. So you can see that this stone is really smooth at this end. That surface would have been lying on the top of a hillside, being smoothed by the glaciers in the last ice age. And you can see traces of Neolithic carvings on it.
Oh, yeah, so these, yeah, there we go.
You can see a whole series of cup and ring marks, more than 40 of them dotted across the surface of this stone. So this was a big slab of rock art on top of a hilltop that has been transported down here to be used for the cover of a Bronze Age kist.
It's fascinating how this ancient slab, decorated with Neolithic art, was later reused as a Bronze Age coffin lid for this wealthy individual. And the Bronze Age appropriation of this Stone Age art didn't stop there. As you look closer, you notice that they also added their own personal carvings to it.
There are lots of wonderful carvings, very shallow, but once you get your eye in, you can see the shapes of axes emerging from this stone.
Is that on there as well?
So yeah, there's more than a dozen covering this surface and cutting across the surface of these earlier cut marks. So redressing this stone in the Bronze Age to go as a very rich offering with this burial.
And is this a new, different type of rock art we see here then? Because so far we've really been looking at like cuppet ring marks and so on. But axe heads, this is something which seems completely different.
Yeah, it's very rare to get axe heads carved on stone. There's only a few places in Britain where they're carved at all. Most of those are in this immediate area around Kilmartin, and then of course there's Stonehenge, which has hundreds of these carvings across its surface. But what's quite nice with these is that you can see the forms of the axes represented. So we can see here this sort of gently curved edge. That is a classic early Bronze Age flat axe. So while we don't have the actual metalwork buried here, we can see what style of axe, and so therefore date when these carvings were made, about 2000 or so BC.
For this elite figure buried in Kilmartin Glen, the axe head seems to have been a symbol of his power and wealth. Very likely, he was one of these Bronze Age tycoons, controlling the flow of metals through the important connection hub that was Kilmartin Glen roughly 4,000 years ago. But axe heads weren't the only items that it appears these tycoons were transporting, suggested by one massive, unique piece of rock art also found in Kilmartin Glen. The original doesn't survive, but Matthew has brought out a copy to show me.
It's a really peculiar piece that would have stood upright, with this being the top and this being the bottom, and it's referred to as a halberd pillar.
The Bronze Age halberd was an extraordinary bladed object. Streamlined in its design, this piece of metal resembled a pick and was a truly terrifying weapon.
There have actually been tests with this sort of weapon, and they're incredibly deadly. And what we seem to have here is a depiction of one of these halberds up at the top, and then it would have been hafted at its side, and the haft runs down here. But then you've got this decoration referred to as almost a rake decoration that we don't fully understand, and it seems to predate the carving of the halberd, but would have originally had this long line all the way across, and then these lines coming off it. If we take the argument that this was carved for the purposes of inclusion in an early Bronze Age kist, then it suggests that these earlier pieces of rock art must be earlier, are probably Neolithic in origin.
It's really interesting how you have this rock art made in the Neolithic times being reused by these new people who've since come into Kilmartin Glen, made a wealthy living, and then have it in their graves.
Rock art seems to be the thing to kind of take and place in a Bronze Age kist. This is the only depiction of a hafted halberd on rock art from Britain, which makes it really, really unusual.
For a long time, axe heads and that potential halberd were the only examples of prehistoric figurative rock art that archaeologists knew of from Kilmartin Glen, indeed from the whole of Scotland. They had no examples, for instance, of animals being depicted on this ancient art. That was, however, until very recently.
This is Dunclegaig Cairn, another of these extraordinary Bronze Age cairns created for the elite living in this area of Britain. Situated just a bit further south of most of the other tombs and stone circles, it's another striking example of burial architecture from Kilmartin. But it's on the inside where you can see something absolutely extraordinary. To show me, I've teamed up with Joanna.
So Joanna, we're inside the cairn now, but where should we be looking?
So if you shine your light here, can
Okay.
you see where the antlers are?
Oh yes, look at that. So that's an antler right there.
Exactly, exactly. And there's this fissure here which is slightly misleading because it looks like the antler is coming out of it. But actually, if you look further here, you can see the head. Can you see the head?
Yes, and I see the other antler too. Yes,
Exactly.
it's together. And if you've put your finger on it and you follow it, you can follow it down. Is this the neck, I'm guessing?
Exactly, that's the neck all the way down.
And then the body. And then what have we got down here? We got other bits of the body too.
Yeah, yeah. So you have the back, you've got the tail. Can you see the tail?
Oh yes, right at the end too. So even little details like that are included.
Yeah, and the pointy legs as well.
Oh yes, you follow that. So 1, 2, 3, 4 legs. Joanna, this is absolutely astonishing. This piece of rock art, there's so much detail to this particular stag.
It is a very naturalistic representation of an adult male deer.
I mean, I've seen pictures of this on the internet, and when it was announced to the world last year, it looked amazing then. But just to see it now in person, underneath this huge slab of stone, it's absolutely breathtaking. It really does blow your mind, doesn't it?
It's incredible to see this amazing discovery up close. And this was just one of several stag depictions Joanna and her colleagues uncovered under this slab of stone. Only recently found, it is one of the most important prehistoric rock art discoveries of the past century.
It is the first time that we know of animal depictions of this period and created in such a naturalistic way.
And you mentioned this period, so when do we think that these stag rock art depictions date to?
So big question. Chronology with rock art is always very complicated. It will very much depend whether the animals were carved before or after this stone was placed here to seal this kist. So this monument that you see here, it's an early Bronze Age cairn, and it has two more kists back there that are very nicely dated to the early Bronze Age. This kist, however, is slightly more complicated because all about it, all the characteristics about it are slightly odd. So the suggestion is that this kist would be the primary burial of this monument. So this would be the first tomb that existed here, probably dating to the Neolithic, and then the others were added at a later stage. So it is possible that the animals date to the Neolithic if they were put here at the same time that they built this kist. But it's also possible that they were created out in the landscape and were there for centuries even, and then quarried and placed on top of the kist. In those circumstances, they could be much older.
Being such a unique discovery also throws up some exciting complications for archaeologists like Joanna.
It does, because we thought that we had a really good idea of what prehistoric rock art is in Britain and Ireland even, mainly composed of cup and ring motifs and other circular variations. And now we have these animals which are completely unique, but at the same time they do bring us closer to other areas in Europe where we also have rock art being carved in the landscape, but where animals were also being depicted. So now we have the geometric and the figurative in the form of animal depictions, which we also have in other places.
And I guess it promises, therefore, with this discovery, that there could be future figurative rock art discoveries found in Scotland.
There's definitely going to be some more. We just need to know where to find them.
Although its importance would ultimately fade as the Bronze Age progressed, for centuries Kilmartin Glen was the centre of an extraordinary ceremonial landscape filled with remarkable monuments. Rich in stone and Bronze Age archaeology, this valley's prehistoric remains continue to amaze visitors and archaeologists alike.
And so, Alison, why do you think Kilmartin Glen is so significant in the story of prehistoric Scotland?
I think it's really important because it shows us how control over a relatively rare resource can then manifest itself in expressions of power and status. So it's a classic example of people who got rich and then they showed off their wealth and power by making very ostentatious graves for the dead. And before that, it was important because it's part of this amazing story of long-distance connections in the late Neolithic, around 3000 BC. So they were in contact with people in Orkney. They went up to Orkney. They came back with wonderful ideas. They built their stone circles in Kilmartin Glen then. So really, it's well-connected elites. It's an interesting story of what people with power did with their power.
I've been absolutely blown away by my time here at Kilmartin Glen. It's such an extraordinary area, rich in remarkable prehistory. We've gone from the Neolithic to the end of the Bronze Age, from exploring elaborate burial cairns to laying eyes upon one of the greatest rock art discoveries in recent history. Kilmartin Glen, truly, it's one of the great gems of prehistoric Scotland. But it's time to move on, because the Iron Age awaits, and with it, some of the most extraordinary structures in Scotland's prehistory. The age of this country's iconic dry stone roundhouses is just around the corner.
My journey through Scotland's prehistoric past has taken me from Stone Age Orkney, with its amazing 5,000-year-old structures, to the mysterious stone carvings and burials of Bronze Age Kilmartin Glen. Now I'm heading to the Western Highlands to begin my exploration of Scotland's Iron Age and the extraordinary buildings it has left behind. The Iron Age in Scotland lasted for roughly 1,000 years, beginning in around 800 BC, when iron started to replace bronze as the metal of choice. And this is one of the Iron Age's most mysterious legacies. It's called a broch. 2,500 years ago, brochs like this could be found all across northern Scotland. But first and foremost, what is a broch?
A broch is a circular dry stone tower. It's a roundhouse. And this is Duntell at Glenelg. I can see a beautiful landscape in front of me, stretching down rolling hills towards the coast. Situated right here is one of the most impressive brochs still standing in Scotland. At some places, still reaching a height of around 10 metres.
The origins of brochs are debated, but they likely stretch back to the end of the preceding Bronze Age, when climatic deterioration forced societies to adapt and to build new kinds of structures to live in. These included circular stone buildings called Atlantic roundhouses. Over time, these houses became more and more complex, ultimately resulting in the brochs. No two brochs are the same. The building of these Iron Age skyscrapers varied across Scotland, but there are some regular features. The bottom of the broch wall has an iconic receding slope, or batter, but further up, it becomes vertical. The wall itself is made of dry stone, stones placed together without mortar. And above the entranceway, you have a large slab of stone called the lintel stone. The people who built this broch were remarkable Iron Age stonemasons.
And here we have the heart of the broch itself. It's quite a wide, open area, some 10 metres in diameter. You can imagine a hearth being here right in the centre, human activity happening all around, perhaps animals placed in lower levels. And it's also a really interesting place where you can see some other very iconic architectural features. As you walk near the inner wall of the broch, you notice this line of stones protruding from it. Now this is a scarcement, and it indicates where a floor would have been on the initial broch. Now Duntelve has two scarcements. We have one at eye level right here, and the other is right up there near the top of the structure. It's unlikely that that top one was to indicate another floor, but it's almost certain that it was to hold up the roof of this broch.
Most brochs have an outer and an inner wall, and the Iron Age people were sure to make the most out of the hollow space this created. This was where they placed stairs to access different levels of the broch, the multi-storey mansions of prehistoric Scotland. And it was also where they created small rooms called galleries, each room separated by a large slab of stone. Why so many brochs were built with this characteristic hollow wall is probably to do with weight distribution, to improve the stability of the structure. Making sure these towers didn't collapse was evidently a major concern for those prehistoric architects building brochs like Duntelve, evidenced by another peculiar feature.
If you have a look at the interior of this broch, you see two hollowed out sections, one above the entranceway itself and another slightly to the right, starting about a third of the way up the broch. Now these are called voids. They're a more unusual part of the broch. You don't see them in every broch across Scotland, but their function is probably similar to that of the hollow wall. It's to do with weight distribution, for improving stability, for taking less weight off individual dry stones, and therefore ensuring that these ancient towers stayed upright.
In their prime, brochs like Duntelve were the megastructures of northern Britain, stone symbols of power that dominated the local landscape. But they were also homes, and to learn more about that, it's time to head much further north.
I've come to Clachtol in the far northwestern reaches of Scotland, in Sutherland. It's a place I know relatively well. I've been coming to this area of Britain since I was 6 years old. It is, in my opinion, one of the most beautiful areas in the whole of Britain. But Clachtol is also home to one of the most important broch sites in the country, one that has now revealed some stunning secrets.
Precariously positioned on top of very uneven bedrock right by the coast, Clachtol Broch's location is astonishing. And in 2017, a team of archaeologists led an excavation of this broch, working closely with the local community heritage group Historic Asint. I'm meeting Gordon Slight to find out more.
Gordon, talk to me about what this whole area of the broch looks like when excavations began back in 2017.
There was rubble right up to within inches of the top of the wall.
Wow.
Right the way down here. You could come into the entrance from the outside, but you then hit a wall of rubble. It was completely chock-a-block full. So we removed everything, and then we came down on a layer of very, very charcoal-rich, loose deposits. Sandy, lots of fragmented stone, but all these signs of burning.
As Gordon and his team uncovered more of the broch, it soon became apparent that this structure had met a devastating, fiery end.
We've no idea what caused that fire. It could just have been an accidental fire. Everything began to burn very, very quickly. You're in something rather like a chimney. Once you have set fire to your timber structures inside, which have been really dry, We did some experiments with creating platforms a few metres above the ground and then putting a small fire underneath to see how long it would take for them to burn down. And it took between 7 and 9 minutes.
Wow, so really quick. It's absolutely extraordinary. I hesitate to call it the Pompeii of brochs, but it does, you can kind of understand, can't you? It kind of gives you that snapshot into the final moments of this broch. And is that why it's so significant, and excavating this broch, is that it does give us this real interesting insight into life in one of these prehistoric towers?
Yes, I mean, with most other broch excavations, what you come down on when you get to the occupation layers, and what we expected to come down on, was 200 to 300 years worth of material all muddled up. Instead of which we came down on 50 years worth, and so we got this sudden picture of the whole of the interior at one phase in its life, and that is more or less unique on any excavation site of this age, and certainly on a broch site.
What this picture of the interior revealed was that before it burned down, Clactol Broch had an agricultural purpose. This was an Iron Age farmhouse.
Here we have the knocking stone. It is a large beach boulder that has had a hollow carved into it, and you put your unprocessed grain into there and bash it with a large stick or stone to break the husks. You then take it out and transfer it to a quernstone to actually then create your flour. We had lots and lots of farming tools, sickles, scythes, adzes. It was impossible to identify what most of them were. It was just a mass of rusty iron, and we were very surprised to find it, because given the fact that it's had the sea breaking over it for 2,000 years, we didn't expect to find any iron at all. But it's come out as quite an interesting collection. I think it's 40 separate implements that we've discovered eventually.
It's amazing to think that this huge tower, its function, as you say, could have been one associated largely with agriculture.
Yeah, there were the remains of a dead sheep in there, and it was an Iron Age sheep, we think, rather than a more recent one. So that was all, again, part and parcel of the farming side of it.
I'm keen to learn more about Clactol's groundbreaking excavation and the artefacts they uncovered. So I've come to AOC Archaeology's HQ in Edinburgh. I'm meeting Dr. Graham Cavers, who led the excavation.
So Graham, what are we looking at here?
So what we have here is a 3D laser scan of the site. So this is the broch recorded in really high level of detail using 3D laser scanning. And that's allowed us to reconstruct the position of every stone in this building, but also all the intramural spaces, or the galleries within the wall, that help us understand how the broch was built and used. One of the things that's most useful about 3D data is that we can render it in different ways. So we're able to show, the different height on the structure. So the red colour here is showing us the higher up parts of the building, and that's fading down to the oranges and the greens in the lower parts of the structure. So it just gives you a much better sense of the three-dimensionality of the building.
It's thanks to technology like these models that Graham and his fellow archaeologists can precisely record the various structural elements of Clactol Broch, further piecing together this ancient tower's turbulent history. But the greatest treasures from the Broch were the artefacts they unearthed. Like Pompeii and other sites that experienced a sudden, violent end, Clactol's infamous fire has preserved an array of incredible objects. Dr. Dawn McLaren is going to show me a few of them.
Dawn, what are these round stone bowl-shaped objects we've got here?
So these objects here are what we think are steatite lamps. They've been made from a type of quite soft, talc-rich stone, which is easy to carve, but it's also very good at withstanding a lot of heat. So they make perfect containers for holding oils or fats that could be burnt to provide lighting. The fact that we've got burning inside, we've got sooting around the edges, and we actually got some residue analysis to help us understand what kind of fuels they were using.
More than 2,000 years ago, these stone objects contained natural fuels, which Clactol brochs occupants used to light up the inside of the farmhouse. These were Iron Age lamps.
We found other objects which can help us to tell the story of these lamps in the form of these little wooden splinters.
Oh, yes.
Although they're a little abraded now just through the passage of time, these are what we think are fir candles, which are types of basically prehistoric matches. They're made of a very resinous wood, so they would have caught fire very quickly, and you could light one end, and that would have helped you to be able to transfer your fire either to the central hearth or into your little lamps.
The artefacts uncovered from Clactol give us this incredible insight into what life was like inside one of these Iron Age towers. From how these people illuminated the interior to what they wore.
These are examples of spindle whorls, and these were weights that were essentially put at the end of a wooden spindle, and this would have helped give a bit of weight so that you could spin wool into yarn. And we even have a fragment of the yarn surviving.
This is amazing because this is ancient textiles, this is clothing, and this is something that normally we don't have that much evidence surviving of.
Absolutely, and this has only been preserved due to the waterlogged conditions in one area of the broch, so we're very lucky to have found it. We quite regularly find the spindle whorls surviving, which tell us that there's textile production going on at these sites, but we so rarely ever see the textile itself or the yarn in the process of being produced. So this just gives us a fantastic insight into some of the craft processes that we know are going on, but we so rarely see.
It's the survival of small, organic objects like this that makes the Clactol broch excavation so extraordinary. We can see what these prehistoric people were crafting there roughly 2,500 years ago, and we can also see what they were eating.
We know from our work on site that there were a variety of different areas around the broch. We know that some areas were quite wet and probably would have remained unused. But we also have fantastic evidence from within the broch itself of charred cereal grains. And the collection I'm holding here are charred barley grains which have been processed.
Well, that's so fascinating. So these charred remains here that I'm guessing you don't get from many sites, but they reveal, you said, they're not taking everything from the sea, although they're right on the sea.
Absolutely.
They've got crops, they're eating lots of land-based agricultural foods.
Yeah, a really mixed diet.
It's astonishing how an infamous destructive end to this broch has resulted in so much remarkable archaeology being preserved, giving us this rare insight into what life was like in an Iron Age tower like this more than 2,000 years ago. But for me, it's also astonishing because of this structure's transformation in recent history. How a dream by the local community set in motion a series of events that ultimately resulted in this groundbreaking excavation. An excavation that transformed Clactol from a collapsing set of stones into one of the most informative broch sites in the whole of Scotland.
From Clactol, I'm heading east, driving through some of the most beautiful scenery in Britain en route to my next destination. This is Dundonegall, situated in the rural heart of Sutherland. Nestled next to the River Strathmore, it's a great example of how Iron Age communities didn't always build their brochs near the coast, but sometimes further inland, next to rivers. In its prime, more than 2,000 years ago, this megastructure would have dominated the surrounding valley, an Iron Age symbol of power and authority. But Dundonegall is only a taste of what's to come, as we continue east along Britain's north coast. And it's not long before you enter an area of Scotland that is renowned as the beating heart of brochs.
I've come to Knivester in Caithness, just south of John O'Groats, near Britain's northeastern edge. And this here is Knivester Broch, situated on this promontory. Now, at first glance from ground level, you'd be forgiven for thinking that this broch, well, it doesn't look that impressive. But that all changes when you see it from the air.
Caithness has the largest concentration of brochs in the whole of Scotland. To tell the story of the brochs, you have to understand the important role that Caithness played in it. To help me understand, I'm teaming up with Ian McLean from the Caithness Broch Project.
Caithness is known as the home of the broch because there's more brochs in Caithness than there is anywhere else in Scotland. We've about over 200 brochs roughly, and we think that's down to the fact that there's more fertile ground in Caithness.
And whereabouts in Caithness do we find broch sites?
There are a lot of brochs along the coastline of Caithness, specifically this part here, but there's also just as many brochs inland following the watercourses. Here at Knivester Broch, this is one of a concentration of many coastal brochs that are built on top of a rocky promontory jutting out into the sea.
Visually, Knivester is one of the most impressive broch remains in the whole of Caithness. But constructed on top of this cliffside also begs a big military question. Could this broch have served as a prehistoric fort, as a defensive bastion?
The main mysteries of brochs are the defensive structures. I mean, the walls are 5 metres thick, and that makes us think of things like castles. But I suppose the position that the brochs are built in, why would a community choose to build a structure on a peninsula jutting out into the sea with a great defensive wall across the front of it? So there has to be a defensive aspect to that there, which begs the question, who are they defending from? I think they're defending from each other. What's likely going on here is there's a bit of a warrior raiding society happening. The communities are defending their wealth, which is probably cattle and or grain, from one another, and that was the need then to build their settlements in easily defendable locations.
Now we've got the North Sea, the sea out there. Could there have been a potential threat from ancient sea raiders too?
Yeah, there must be seagoing communities here. It's possible that they're raiding in their boats along the coast, and that is possibly why they've decided to build on this high cliffy promontory, which must be defendable not only from the land but also from the sea.
It's fascinating, having now visited several brochs across northern Scotland, to think about how much time and effort must have gone into building one of these monumental structures more than 2,000 years ago. But how did they do it? Well, fortunately, I've come to the right place to find out more.
Ian has brought me to nearby Spittal Quarry to show me how he believes one of these brochs could have been constructed.
This is actually a modern reconstruction of a broch. It's a model broch that was built as part of an experiment only about 10 to 15 years ago.
So this is a great example of experimental archaeology in the flesh.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Alongside his boundless passion for brochs, Ian is an expert dry stone builder, and he's brought some tools that he believes these Iron Age people would have used to help them build these massive towers.
So this is the outside edge of the broch wall now, which has that iconic batter, where the wall, as it ascends in height, slopes inward, and that gives the structure stability as it gets taller. To maintain the batter, they would possibly use a tool like this, which would measure the angle and the slope of the wall going up. So you would set that there, and when the line meets the dot there, you know that is set at the perfect angle. So this broch here hasn't been built to such strict tolerances. The good ones that are still standing are well constructed brochs, but I think for the most part the majority of them weren't so well constructed, which might show that they were built by members of the community and the families that were going to be living in them. Not everybody was an expert stonemason back then, and the quality of the stonework, the lack of quality of the stonework, can really reflect that.
Taking me around this replica broch, Ian continues explaining how he believes these Iron Age people went about building one of these structures. From how they kept the heavy stones level, to how they maintained the iconic circular radius of the interior. But what do we know about the stones themselves? The building blocks of the broch.
So this is the famous Caithness stone, which is splits into flat laminar pieces.
Yes.
So there's over 2,000 tonnes of stone went into the construction of a broch. But I think they would have generally used field stone that was cleared from the site and then gathered up first before commencing construction.
So at Caithness, like elsewhere in Scotland, the stone material being used to build these brochs, it's local stone?
Yeah, it's locally acquired stone. It's actually a sandstone that's gone through a metamorphic process to create this flat laminar pieces. It's quite brittle, that just so happen to be very easy to build with because they fit together quite easily.
Right, so we've seen so many of these brochs now. I'm dying to get hands on and to see how they were constructed.
Let's do it. So there's this stone here that I'll give you.
Okay.
One of the key points here is to lay it with the length of the stone going into the wall, and that provides stability for it.
So that having it this kind of way, we're thinking?
That's it, it's more right there.
Okay.
Then once you've got your stone in position, you can see it's wobbling around a little bit.
Yeah.
So if you can put some of these pinning stones underneath it,
okay,
all around, and then check to see if the stone is wobbling now.
Yeah.
When that's quite a bit more solid there we go. And then you can then use this tool here to check that it's in the radius for the rest of the building. There we go. And then so now you have this big gap here.
Yes.
And what's key to do here is to make sure that these gaps are filled up with more pinning stone. So if you could lay some of those stones in between those gaps
and these are slightly bigger ones, aren't they?
That's right.
Okay, yeah.
So that all the gaps are filled up, all the voids are filled up with stone.
And is there any particular technique for these smaller stones?
I like to make sure that they're all lying on their flat
and
not upright.
It's a bit more flat, gotcha. Right. And is this something you see time and time again in the brochs? These big stones and then these smaller ones in the gaps?
That's right, yeah. So we also see diminishing courses. So we see the biggest stones in the broch down at the bottom, and the stones are gradually getting smaller as the broch gets taller, because who wants to be lifting huge stones up 10 metres high?
Absolutely. Now we've just done that actually relatively quickly with that big stone, these smaller ones all around it. But how much time, how many hours do you think it would have taken for a community to create a broch like we've seen at Nibster or somewhere else?
There's been various calculations done on how long it would take to build 2,000 tonnes of stone. Most of those calculations are based on just the construction and not the acquiring of the materials and labouring them to the site. So they think it would take 3 teams up to 200 days just building alone.
All across northern Scotland, more than 2,000 years ago, Iron Age communities were coming together to create these monumental prehistoric towers. All of them would have required a significant amount of time and effort, first to build and then to maintain by the local community. And it's these communities that I'm keen to learn more about. For that, I'm heading back to where our series began, Orkney. Today, Orkney is renowned for its extraordinary 5,000-year-old Stone Age remains. From massive tombs like Mace Howe to the best preserved Neolithic settlement in Western Europe. But the monumentality here didn't stop with the end of the Stone Age.
This is Gurness, the remains of an Iron Age village on the northeastern coastline of the mainland. Now, some 2,500 years ago, Gurness was the centre of a large, complex Orcadian community. And towering over the landscape, right at its heart, was a broch.
Brochs rarely stood in isolation, but it's only from places like Gurness that you can really see this from the surviving archaeology. Orcadian broch expert Dr. Martin Carruthers is here to explain how this structure fitted in with the local community.
Martin, been to several brochs already over this programme, but of all of these brochs, I've never seen one full of so much stuff still here.
Yes, Gurness is quite well famed for, I don't mean to be rude, but the litter of uprights and features that are in the interior. But of course that's really interesting for us in archaeological terms, because there's lots for us to get our teeth into.
We've already looked at the close link brochs had with agriculture during the Iron Age. But tucked away amidst the stone remains, Gurness has evidence for a much wider range of activities happening within this broch.
I don't know if you can see, it's quite in the shadow here, there's a nicely carved,
oh yes,
a deeply set elliptical or sub-oval shaped carving within the rock. And this is an ingot mould. So this is the kind of thing that would be used by metal workers when they're preparing alloys, things like copper alloys of bronze and brass and the like, or even precious metals like silver. They're casting that stuff and they're pouring it into a mould like this. So it is indeed, it's an indicator of non-agriculturally related activities, craft activities certainly, but metalworking in this case. And maybe that is an indication of the centrality of that kind of activity to their social lives and their domestic lives within the building. It's an important activity and it's visible to the community almost just off of the main public area.
This small object, still in situ, further affirms how brochs had several purposes, from houses to granaries to smithies. But to understand Gurness fully, you need to understand its connection to the surrounding structures. Gurness was not just a broch, it was an entire Iron Age settlement.
And this must have been a busy place. That village must have had dozens and dozens of people. Some estimates put that at 200 to 300 people resident within the village in its heyday here back in the Middle Iron Age. So how did those people relate to whoever was presumably living within the broch? And some archaeologists have seen that as in a hierarchical model, where the broch is the elite residence of a very high status and important family or group of individuals, with retainers or people of a lower social status resident within the houses, probably offering up agricultural services. And another model of it is that the villagers might hold the broch in common, almost a little bit like the hub of their community, where they might store produce in the upper stories and they might come in and plan for the agricultural cycle. And the consensus within archaeology generally has gone towards the hierarchical model.
And it's so interesting, if the village is contemporary with the broch, a word that is often associated with the Iron Age, I know there are problems with it, but is the word tribe.
Mm-hmm.
So how can we imagine Gurness as a community?
I can very well imagine that the amount of effort that's invested, the labour that's put into and the resources that's put into building these things means that everyone has a stake in them and in their success within this community. And this is effectively a walled community, so it feels like a sealed off community. Now in reality it must have had many interactions with neighbours, but at the same time I think the identity here is very much focused on the great house here. And I think there were a series of great houses across Orkney and beyond, and these communities would focus on these as effectively badges and totems of their identity. So very much these are the central places of the community life and of the identity of these groups. And yes, you could I think feasibly call them clans or tribes in that sense.
During the Stone Age, Orkney had been this great centre of prehistoric Britain, with connections stretching across the British Isles and beyond. And this continued down into the Iron Age. Broch villages such as Gurness would have welcomed people venturing here from distant shores.
In Orkney, we've been finding evidence for connections to Shetland. We've found amber from the Baltic. We've found a whole series of Roman items, Roman pottery, Roman metalwork and glassware as well, that are coming from the Roman province, which was to the south of us, of course, during the 1st, 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. So there are further flung connections. So although this is a community that is presenting itself as quite bounded, almost isolated through the boundaries of the community, nevertheless they're interacting with much, much further afield contacts through trade, exchange, relationships of one kind or another.
So it's not too far to suggest that perhaps some 2,000 years ago, a trader, perhaps a Roman, someone who would have been to the Roman Empire, would have walked up this central street here with goods, with trade goods, something like that, and come to a broch like Gurness, come to a community like this.
Yeah, I think that's very likely indeed, absolutely. We know the Romans are aware of these communities as far north as Orkney and beyond. We know that there are materials coming into these communities. There are probably also materials coming out of these areas and down into the province. You know, you could think of furs, you could think of textiles, hides, all sorts of things that might be of interest to the province. Certainly this two-way exchange.
At the same time that Britain was coming under Roman control in the 1st century AD, up here in Orkney, broch villages like Gurness continued to thrive. And Gurness is just one of many remarkable broch villages that dominated Orkney during the Iron Age. The size of these communities are unmatched anywhere else in Scotland.
I think one of the factors in that is the incredibly good agricultural land here. They're producing large volumes of food, they're feasting heavily. Orkney is a rich place. It produces lots of food, it feeds lots of mouths. Lots of people can be sustained by that. These large communities then go on to have this powerful basis in the local area.
It's absolutely astonishing to think, because sometimes we see the Neolithic as the golden age, but looking at structures like this and hearing about all the archaeology that's been uncovered and the connections they had, it almost seems that actually the prominence of Orkney remains for thousands of years post the Stone Age into the Iron Age at the time of Gurness.
Yeah, and I think during the Iron Age, Orkney's no backwater. It's an amazingly powerful, energetic, creative and innovative place. And we shouldn't lose sight of that. When we excavate these old remains, we should remember these were dynamic places that had relationships much further afield and connections and understandings of a wider world.
I've been fascinated by Scotland's prehistoric brochs for years now. But in many ways, these Iron Age towers remain as enigmatic as ever. There are so many questions that still remain unanswered. But thanks to some extraordinary recent archaeological discoveries and the dedication of enthusiasts determined to preserve these structures, well, new information is starting to emerge. For their time, these brochs were the megastructures of northern Britain. They were homes, they were symbols of power, they were centres of communities. Visually, yes, maybe they don't look as striking as classical Greek temples or ancient Egyptian tombs today, but these brochs, the pinnacle of Scotland's prehistoric architecture, well, they tell an incredible story about the Iron Age in the north of the British Isles. And who knows what secrets they'll reveal in the years ahead. It's rather fitting that we end our journey where we started it, here on Orkney, a group of islands rich in prehistory, stretching from the Stone Age to the Iron Age. And what a journey it's been.
In this series, we've covered thousands of years of prehistory, travelling through some of the most striking scenery on Earth, meeting remarkable experts, and learning more about the lives of these ancient peoples who dwelled in this area of the world several millennia ago.
In the past, people underestimated the sophistication of these prehistoric societies, but no longer. Thanks to some breathtaking archaeological breakthroughs, both old and new, we're learning more about how these men and women lived thousands of years ago. Today, it's easy to be swept away by Scotland's rich recorded history. But for me at least, it's this land's mysterious prehistoric past that truly is the jewel in Scotland's crown.
Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.